So Devon, you're known as the historian's historian. Was that always the case?
I developed my interest in local history basically when I was about 35 years old. I'd grown up around a lot of the history. My family had been from this area, well, since back into the 1800s, some of them. And I grew up, I remember my great-grandmother, she was born in 1872 when I was younger, and other people, and grew up with people talking about the things that had gone on in and around the Mayville area and things like that. Stockton area too. My grandfather, Bertrand Taylor, had worked on the railroads, particularly the JW and NW, but he worked on all the railroads around the lake, some on the steamboats, some for the Pennsylvania and out in Ohio and all that. And in 1913, he developed an interest in photography and started taking and developing his own pictures, printing them mostly on picture postcards. And I grew up seeing those pictures, and I have those pictures now. My great-grandmother kept diaries for most of her life, and I've got most of those, but 1913 is one year that's missing, so I don't know quite how he got going on doing that. But at any rate, I got interested in local history, and I wrote to newspaper about them possibly doing a column on local history. And they said, well, that'd be great, would you do it? So that kind of got me going. And I used my great-grandfather's photographs that I knew some of the people, some of the things that were going on, but I got really interested and started trying to find out what was going on in there, the time period, the stories around them. My father, who was born in 1918, helped me quite a bit with that, and he remembered a tremendous amount of local history. He lived to be 94, and his memory was sharp right up to the end, so he was helpful in getting me going. So as I went along, I did that for a while, and then the village of Mayville had an opening for historian when Dorothea Bertram, who was the previous historian, decided she didn't want to do it. And they asked me, and I said, well, okay, I don't know that much about it. And that was 1991. And I learned, with a lot of help, from a lot of different historians over the years, and developing resources, taking some courses, how to research, find things out, make contacts. And something I really enjoyed. The town of Chautauqua asked me to be a historian several times, in addition to being the village historian. And I did not, I wasn't interested in doing another historian's job, but Gib Hayward, who was a town historian, when he retired from the job, he talked me into taking that over. So that's how I became town historian too. So that's how I got started in an interest in history. Oh, and I had friends that were interested in history too. I had a friend who grew up partially in Saudi Arabia. His father worked in the oil industry, and he was interested in the oil industry in the United States, which basically started out down at Oil Creek, and shortly after the Civil War. And that's the reason the first railroad was put in along this side of the lake, was to provide another outlet for the oil industry. 1867, the railroad started building up from Oil Creek, up through Titusville, Clymer, into Mayville, and then over to the lakeshore at Brockton, where they went up to Buffalo. And that really led to the development of this side of the lake. And a lot more than it had. It was by no means the first railroad in here, or the first, that was the first one was the one that came into Fredonia along the lake shore. And then, of course, the one that came into Jamestown, but this was the first one along the lake. And it opened up. So we had a lot of oil coming out, coming through here. That was the first cargo, and that provided employment for a couple of thousand people for a while. That shortly after the Civil War, as probably most of you know, that there are a lot of unemployed men looking for work, and the oil industry provided some of it, and then building the railroad up through here provided for others, and that Mayville took off. The oil industry, having the railroad in here, it was, instead of a very rough time getting in and out of the area with freight and cargo, it was readily available to bring goods in and take them out, so farmers could get goods in and out more easily. The furniture industry took off in Mayville. The ice industry took off in Mayville and around the lake. And the village of Mayville expanded. And of course, we eventually had another railroad come up the other side of the lake. We had the Chautauqua Traction Company too on this side of the lake. So that's what got me going. He took pictures of, my grandfather Taylor took pictures of a lot of these kind of things, especially construction projects and a lot of the accidents. There were very serious accidents, quite a number of them, and he took pictures of them, developed the pictures, printed up his postcards of them, took orders for them and sold them, and my great-grandmother faithfully recorded those in her diaries. Not all the pictures that he took, but the accident in Hartfield in 1917, where two trolleys ran head-on into each other with two immediate deaths, another death later, tremendous court case, lawsuit involved after that. He took pictures of that. I happen to remember, I believe he printed 180 of those picture postcards. Yeah. And you find a lot of those picture postcards, some with his name on, that he wrote his name on the negative one he printed, and you'll find a lot of those around that people collect, and probably without knowing that he took them. Now, not that he was the only one taking pictures of things like that. There were a lot of other people that did too. But that's basically what got me started and what got me going.
How did Mayville get started? You wrote a wonderful article called "The Brief History of Mayville," and kind of start in the beginning. I'll just lead the sentence here. Seneca Indians gave up their claim to most of this area in the Big Tree Treaty on September 15th, 1797.
Right. Well, the Big Tree Treaty, of course, was signed at Geneseo, where the Big Tree was, and the college is village, and the college is now located. Yeah, the Seneca Indians, this was their hunting ground, and mostly summer encampments. The weather was quite harsh here. Of course, we did have prehistoric inhabitants in the county. Someone I know that farmed, worked on the red brick farm back when it was owned by the Flagg family, plowed up an arrow point that looked like a Clovis point, which you're probably familiar with as being indicative of fairly early occupation in the United States. We eventually had that categorized and typed, and it was, if I remember correctly, Paleo-Archaic. So that would have been somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years ago in the county, which would be as the Ice Age was moving out of here, people were moving in. When people first came into this area, of course, there were a tremendous amount of Indian mounds, forts, artifacts of ancient peoples. This was all written up by T. Apollon Chaney. So these remains were in this area too. Now they most probably died out from disease 200 to 300 years before the first white men came into this area. The Eries, the Neutrals, people of the Cat, they were all inhabitants in this general area. When the French first came into the area in the 1700s, the Senecas were not completely they went to war with the people of the Cat and won the war and then took over this territory. They adopted members of the tribe, and I'm not an expert on this. There's a lot more people that know a great deal more than I do. But at any rate, the Senecas were here. They had trails. There was a regular trail that ran along the lakeshore from the area of Erie through Westfield going up to the Buffalo area. There was one that came from Westfield over here onto Lake Chautauqua, or the Portage Road, and which is the Portage Trail. And that was an early egress into this area. The Senecas were quite friendly into this when people came into this area. Judge Peacock, who was the Holland Land Company agent, came in, and the Holland Land Company was a consortium of Dutch banking houses, 6 Dutch banking houses that purchased a large amount of property, which they, of course, couldn't claim ownership to until the Senecas, the Iroquois, but in this area, the Senecas had signed off on their claim, which they did, of course, reserving some reservation property for themselves in Cattaraugus, Chautauqua County. So once that was, the treaty was signed and they had legal acquisition of the property. Of course, we had people coming in here prior to property being sold, but not by much. And once the property was sold, they had to have it surveyed, of course. Judge Peacock came in as a surveyor and mapped out the property. You can still, if you know where to look, find some of the, and it's a very few, original block markers from the original survey that were placed. There used to be more, but they're pretty much gone now. And he came in here, 1804 was the first settler on Chautauqua Lake in the village of Mayville. That was McIntyre, he called himself Dr. Alexander McIntyre, claimed to have been kidnapped by the Indians at one time, had his ears cut and elongated, and learned herbal medicine from them. And when Peacock came in as part of his survey, he left goods with Alexander McIntyre, food supplies, so on and so forth. And for the winter survey, and when he came back, McIntyre had eaten the food supplies, so they kind of had to fend on their own. But and he'd built a stockaded fort here in Mayville. The Holland Land Company set Peacock up as the sales agent in Mayville, and the Holland Land Company vault is still there. That's not in the original location. It was moved there in 1965 from its original location, but it was next to the what was known as the Peacock Inn, which was his second residence. Peacock was the land company agent. He was friendly. There were Indians that visited him there a lot. He was well thought of, and he handled sales and of the Holland Land Company property. And the property, the very earliest versions and the very earliest survey maps of Mayville show it as May and then Ville as separate words.
What's the source of the May?
Well, there are a number of versions of the story. Norman Carlson, whom you know from Jamestown, has pretty convincing evidence that it was named after one of the director's wives, who was from the May family, of fame up in New England area. But there are other versions. William Peacock said that it was because it was named after a daughter that Paul Busteye had at one of the meetings that they had there, that they came with the baby and that she was named May. He didn't have that baby. Then there's a version where the name came because the weather was often very beautiful in May, so it was Mayville. So there's a number of different versions as to where the actual name came from.
So, not as you're going through the history and the title searches of Mayville, and you go back to the Holland Land Company and you work your way through, and not everybody was happy with the way the agents for the Holland Land Company were working plying their trade. And there was actually a raid on the Holland Land Company vaults. Could you explain how that was, what happened there?
Well, that came about because under Peacock, and at first the terms for purchasing property were quite liberal. Someone could come in, they could leave a gun as a down payment that they would hold, and payment was, they could pay on easy terms as they had it, and New York State had a road tax, which to build roads, and at first they were exempt from the road tax, but after a while that had to be paid, and the Holland Land Company eventually sold out their interest to new owners, and rather than people being able to work on the roads to be exempt from the tax and have easy payments, the new owners decided that they were going to make terms more difficult. The people were going to have to pay if they owed back money, that they were going to call in the mortgage, they were going to foreclose on the property, and a lot of people couldn't afford that. So there were a lot of grumblings around the county. There were meetings complaining about this, and eventually in 1835 there was a meeting in Barnhart's Inn down in Hartfield where a crowd got together and they decided to do something about it. They were going to come up to Mayville and destroy the records, which they did. Crowd could have been, nobody knows exactly for sure, could have been as many as 500 people, might have been as little as 200 people. They came up to Mayville. Peacock had advance warning. Donald Mackenzie, who's famous as from Canadian Mackenzie River, Red River Colony and all that, he and the Lewis and Clark expedition and all that, when he retired, he moved to Mayville and was a friend of Judge Peacock's. The best known version of the story was that Mackenzie came down the hill from his house on top of the hill, bodily carried Peacock up the hill to rescue him from the crowd and protected him. There is another version that says that Peacock knew ahead of time and had hitched up his sleigh and was well on his way towards Erie by the time the crowd showed up. But the version with Donald Mackenzie is probably the correct one, as best we know at this time. And the crowd came up and they had people that were good at dismantling things, and they tore the original house apart, broke into the Holland Land Company vault. A great number of the records were taken down into the flats, roughly in the area where the flea market is down there in Hartfield, and burned. Some people rescued some of the records and saved them. And a lot of people somehow thought that this was going to get them out of their obligation to the Holland Land Company. But of course there were duplicate records in Batavia, at the headquarters up there. And Peacock, after that, he did rebuild in Mayville, but the Holland Land Company office was moved to Westfield. William Seward, Seward's Folly, the Alaska Purchase, he was Holland Land Company agent for a while. And Judge Peacock, he went on to become a judge. He was a Mason. The Peacock Lodge in Mayville was named after him. Quite influential. But things, of course, settled down after that. Although the very next year there was the Joseph Damon trial. He was a man outside of Fredonia who had beaten his wife to death with a fireplace poker, and it was the first murder in Chautauqua County. So it was a big scandal. Now, did I say 1835 on the Land Company riot? Because it was the Damon trial in 1835, and it was the Land Company riot in 1836. So now I
Gotta love these historians. I mean,
well, no,
you had us, we didn't care.
no. I
get it.
I sometimes get things a little bit mixed up, but I usually get them straightened out, and that's why I want to refer to things here. So, but yeah, the Damon trial was the first murder in Chautauqua County, and it was a big deal. The trial was held in the new courthouse there, and the hanging took place in Mayville. It was the last public hanging in New York State. Other places disagree, but someone researched it here. And Mayville was the last public hanging. It had been outlawed in New York State here a week before, but the news supposedly didn't get here. Travel was slow. I mean, we only had the Erie Canal, which had opened in 1825, and boat traffic was mostly by mule. And there was the big swamp to go through in the middle of the state. So news was slow, but some people felt that they deliberately didn't recognize that the news had come through so that they could have a public hanging. Well, there was a huge crowd that came to Mayville to see Joseph Damon hung. The sheriff sent out invitations, and people came and they had a picnic because public hangings were public entertainment, particularly in Europe from ancient times. The rope broke. The hanging was on School Hill. It was held within sight of the what was Mayville School at that time. School, of course, was not in session. They put up gallows, even though it later got a reputation as having hung him from a tree. And people came. The rope broke or came loose. He came down without hanging the first time. He said, it was God's will that he shouldn't be hung, that, this was an indication that, that he was innocent, so on and so forth. He'd been spared, but of course they strung him up and hung him anyway. So this was the last, and it's not a pleasant thing now, but it was the last public hanging. They had two more executions where they hung people, but that was in the Mayville jail at the time. And of course now New York State does not execute people, and a lot of the states don't. A lot of people feel that a lifetime in prison is much more of a punishment than a quick execution. So however you feel about that on moral grounds, and I just want to say here, the Holland Land Company riot was February 6, 1835, and the Joseph Damon hanging was May 15th, 1835. The Holland Land Company riot was February 6, 1836. Yeah, I brought a few references here just so I could look these things up.
On the Damon trial and the Damon conviction, the Damon hanging, was there a hue and cry about murder or execution in such a way, or was it just sort of a rite of passage that let's go and show, and was there any outcry that this was crueler than usual punishment or anything like that?
Well, no, there wasn't a big outcry about it. He'd used a defense that he was known to have seizures. He was also known to be drunk a lot. But there was, I guess what you'd call mental and insanity defense. Now you know a lot more than that than I would, but that was kind of overlooked. Yeah, there were definitely people who were against the hanging, but there was not a big public outcry over it that I know of. And once again, I'm not an expert on that, but the records are readily available on that and a number of other things. And this was what you might call the trial of the century for the 1800s in this area, like they called the O.J. trial, the trial of the century when he was tried.
There's no segue to this next question. I don't want anybody to think so. But Doug Houck, among others, have written that Mayville might have been, or arguably was, the source of the Republican Party around the 1850s. Have you researched that? Does it have any sense of validity?
Well, the Mayville Sentinel started in 1835, and Mayville was always a Republican stronghold when I was growing up, when my dad was growing up, and not so much now. And the Republican Party started up in Mayville around that time. I really don't know of any definitive evidence that it started in Mayville, or any definitive evidence that it didn't. The Westfield Republican was, of course, an early Republican newspaper. So it could have started in this area, but I can't tell you for sure whether it did or not. But it was certainly an area Republican stronghold very early on in the party's history.
1874, Chautauqua Institution is founded by Vincent and Miller, which is within the town of Chautauqua.
Mm-hmm.
In your research as town historian, do you get much into that analysis of why this Fairpoint, and why, do you get much into that early years of Chautauqua Institution?
Sometimes. And it depends on what it is. John Schmitz is very good on that, and he does a lot of that research. Now, I do share research with him. He's helped me out a lot too with things that I'm looking at. When I first got going, Alfreda Irwin was historian down here and at the library, and she was wonderful. She helped me out a lot, taught me a lot about Chautauqua. John certainly knows a lot more than I do, but you know, I have found out some things here. Now, when I was researching the...
Like what? Give us some teasers here, Devon, about Chautauqua.
Well, early on, of course, you know that the main entrance to Chautauqua was down by the lake shore, because most people came in by steamboat when they came in on the railroad. And the boat dock, of course, was down there. Then there was a branch railroad line from Mayville to Chautauqua from 1881 to 1926, and also the Chautauqua Traction Company opened up which came in along the upper end of Chautauqua, where the administration, or where the entrance building is now. That was originally a Chautauqua Traction Company station to replace the earlier wooden one. And so when you came to...
Just again, if people who came to Chautauqua via the railroad, what would be the normal route? Would they come to Westfield and then...
No, they'd come to Mayville.
Okay, how would they get there?
On the railroad, what later became the Pennsylvania Railroad. It had a number of names, but in 1900 it became the Pennsylvania Railroad.
Okay.
So
and then they would jump the JW or whatever it was here to come to Chautauqua?
No. This was a branch line. I wrote a book on that. Someone got me going on it here, and
I knew we'd get the answer.
So this is it, and it's a a lot of information on the railroads, and particularly the branch line that came down to here, Chautauqua here, the station, its importance to, and the line up here. A lot of information on railroads, and property in between, the road that you come to Chautauqua from Mayville, where the hill is. That hill was cut down in 1897 when another railroad came in. There was a lot of history about Wameda, Duquesne Heights, the origins of that, and how it influenced Chautauqua. The main entrance to Chautauqua really came about in 1917. I mean, the traction company had people coming in that way from Jamestown, starting in 1904, 1905. But when they put that new brick building up in 1917, which they spent $40,000 on, and President Bester gave a speech, a small speech that about them, the Broadheads, who owned the Broadhead worsted mills in Jamestown. They owned the railroad to Warren. They owned the Jamestown Street Railroad. They bought out the old Chautauqua Lake Railway, which came down the other side of the lake and became the JW and NW. They bought out the steamboats in 1898 that carried passengers to Chautauqua. They were big promoters of Chautauqua. And once that building was there, that became the main way, the main entrance to Chautauqua Institution, rather than coming in by the lake. So,
let me ask a question. I don't know that I know the answer. Was there always a gate so that you had to pay to get into Chautauqua? Was that?
well, yes, yes, it was always.
So we're just carrying on a tradition when we buy a gate pass. I get it.
Yeah, when you came in by the railroad, they had, the railroad didn't come on to what was then Chautauqua grounds. As you know, Chautauqua was expanded at least 3 times since then. The railroad came to the, what was then the edge of Chautauqua, and the Packard estate is now on that property, and that's one of the expansions, but the station was right at the edge of Chautauqua, and if you came in that way, you bought your pass to come into Chautauqua that way. Or you could, of course, come in up above, or if you came in by steamboat, they had a public dock down there, and you paid at the steamboat dock. They had a dock there that was separated for people that were coming into the institution or leaving the institution.
So there was no way to sneak in, even back then?
Oh, people have been sneaking in forever. I don't remember it, but older people told me that there used to be places where the fence was loose, so the kids could come in. You know, kids could sneak in, or sometimes they just come in by boat and come in that way. So yeah, people have snuck in, but and probably still do, but I don't know of any.
Have you, early year, 1875, President Ulysses Grant came to Chautauqua. Has that been part of your research as part of town of Chautauqua historian, how that all transpired and ultimately him coming here?
Not so much, although I have had people contact me about stories in the newspapers, information about it. Of course, he came into Jamestown and then came up the lake by steamboat from Jamestown, and then there was another steamboat that carried the press up to Chautauqua. So there's quite a bit of information about that, but that's not one that I've researched specifically.
Well, let me tell you where he had lunch. in Jamestown was at a place called the Kent Mansion, which is now, ladies and gentlemen, the Robert H.
Jackson Center. Yes, yes, I remember that from being down there.
I had to get that in. By the way, as an aside, Shara Babcock, who was the director of programming for many, many years, her husband's great-great-grandfather was an adjutant of President Grant, and he was on the list of people who was served lunch with Grant at the Kent Mansion, now the Jackson Center, in the Small World Department. And I got to tell you, sometimes you historians throw everything off. Because sometimes there are assumptions that people live with and promote, and one of them is a picture which everybody probably has in this room, someplace on some calendar, of President Grant. It's a long distance shot at a tent allegedly receiving somebody, and that's the picture, the one alleged picture of Ulysses Grant here at the Chautauqua Institution. Then a couple years ago, your friend, John Schmitz, takes a magnifying glass, because there's a flag, as you would expect, a flag right by the president receiving a Bible and uttering apparently thank you, and that was the extent of his speech. So John actually takes the time to count the stars on the flag, and it does not match up to the number of states we had at the time of Grant. So therefore concluded that that one iconic picture of Grant at Chautauqua is fake news. I said, I don't know, John, with all due respect, that's one where I would have just put in my pocket and let that go, because you don't have anything. Now you got zero. Has he told you that story?
Yes. Yeah, John's a neighbor of mine, so.
Okay. So when he found that out, did he run right over and say, Devon, I'm going to break everybody's bubble?
Oh, no, he didn't. Although we're neighbors, we just see each other occasionally in the neighborhood, or at an occasional get-together. More often, it's at the archive building down here when I come down for various reasons.
Mayville has at the top of the hill a historical plaque that says, this is the homestead of Albion Tourget. And also there's in the Mayville Cemetery an obelisk, and it says Tourget.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't help but think about Tourget today, in anticipation of you coming, but also because we do know that Albion Tourget from Mayville represented Homer Plessy.
Yes, the
in
Plessy
the lawsuit
Ferguson.
Of Plessy versus Ferguson, which settled with the constitutional case, statement of separate but equal, which many years later was overruled by Brown versus Board of Education.
Mm-hmm.
Which Jackson was a part. So there's this kind of connect here in Chautauqua County of Albion Tourget, Plessy, Jackson on the court of Brown. What do you know about Albion Tourget?
Well, Albion Tourget was not originally from Mayville. He was in Ohio. He was in the Civil War. He was wounded when he was in the Civil War. He went down south during Reconstruction, and his life was threatened down there. There were attempts on his life. He did become a fairly famous author, writing a number of books, one about Reconstruction in the South. And he did move to Mayville in 1881, built his house there next to the library, the Thorheim. And
where do you get that name from?
The Thorheim, I really don't know.
Sounds like a very Swedish type name.
Yeah, but I don't know. I probably got it somewhere, but I can't tell you off the top of my head.
Check with the historian there, would you? Come and get back to us.
Yeah. So he was there, and he wrote a number of books about the local area. Not the ones that he was most famous for nationally, but there was one, Buttons Inn, which was an inn that was it was called the Halfway House at one time too, that was partway up the portage road between Mayville and Westfield. Back at the time when that was a rough road. I mean, it could take you more than one day to get to Mayville, so people did stay there, especially during bad weather. Travel was not easy early on, and that also figured in the legend of lost gold in Chautauqua Gorge. But supposedly when the French who had been ambushed and hidden their gold in a cave down there came up to the Buttons Inn. Well, the Buttons Inn wasn't there at the time that the French were coming through, so that's inaccurate. And I'm not going to get into whether the legend of the lost gold is true or not, because there are people that passionately believe it's true, and there are people that passionately believe it isn't true, and I don't want to get in the middle of it.
Oh, come on. If somebody were to say, do you believe it or not, just give it a shot. Just forget the history side, just your guts.
Probably not, and if there was, it's probably been found. But the French were in the area. They were several French expeditions that came through Mayville. They built a portage trail into a road. That's why it was called the French Road at one time. It became the Liberty Highway at one time in 1918, one of the early tourist roads in here. I would say probably the French gold didn't really exist, but it's possible. And when they said that the French did come out into a building that was near the gorge, and this is pure speculation, there was the building that was over on what's now the Westfield Conservation Club property near the gorge, which there's not much of it left, I think one log, but it's in the Yorker Museum, which was a large building, log building, no windows, no way to get into it except an underground entrance. And there was another one of those over near the Pennsylvania border. There was the remains of one down in Pennsylvania, and nobody really knows what they are or what they were, but there's speculation that they were possibly storehouses for the French when they had the fur trading business going on in this area, but that's pure speculation. And like I said, nobody knows for sure.
We got you off track but we were on Tourget. He was from Mayville at the time. He took the case on Homer Plessy.
Yes.
And do you know much more about that? I mean, how that happened and why they selected him?
Well, no, I really don't. There's, I guess, what was it? CNN did a special on that, and that's not an aspect of his life that I particularly looked into. There's been an awful lot written on Tourget, and they do have a lot of records and information about him in the Historical Society in Westfield. Matter of fact, when they were filming the special on Plessy versus Ferguson, they did go over and interview John Paul Wolfe, the curator over there, for I guess a couple of hours or something like that, but then it didn't make it into the final cut that went on the air, so he didn't get any credit for that, nor did the County Historical Society. So if you hadn't already heard that, you've heard it now.
Yeah, he put it out quite a bit. He
Oh, yes.
advertised it. And
Oh,
I
yes.
think he was really disappointed. So Tourget, just as in a sidebar, the notes are all there for his oral argument of Plessy versus Ferguson. So for anybody who's really interested, it's fantastic. 3x5 cards of how he argued it, including a brief that talks about the law should be colorblind. Then, just to bring it fast forward to 1950, Robert Jackson had two of the lawyers travel to Westfield to get the copies of the notes, send them down to Washington, where he had a chance to review all that, and that really became part of his thinking as he went through the whole Brown versus Board of Education. A few years ago, Albion Tourget was honored, or they focused on that whole Plessy-Jackson connection, and it became part of a project down at the center. So Mayville, Tourget, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board, it all kind of ties together in a great story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, Tourget died in France as the ambassador to France in 1905. And when his ashes were brought back, the body isn't buried down there, but his ashes are buried down there. And when they dedicated the monument to him down there, they had over 1,000 people come to Mayville, and it was more or less a day-long program. So that was a rather large happening in Mayville, because he was very famous, not just in Mayville, but nationwide, really.
And I understand he spoke quite a bit at Chautauqua as well.
Yes.
What other notables came from Mayville?
Well, I don't know really. There'd be anybody, tremendously noteworthy, that I can think of right offhand, that came from Mayville. Of course, there's a relative of the Honeysett family, Ira Davenport. He and his brother were world famous as spiritualists back in the 1800s, starting in 1851 up through the brother's death in 1875. They toured as spiritualists, which a lot of magicians did back then, but what they really were was escape artists and illusionists, and they had what they called the spirit cabinet, and he was quite familiar with Mayville. His grandparents were Honeysetts, and they came down to visit them quite often, and one of their early tricks, illusions, whatever you'd call it, involved them somehow disappearing off the streets of Buffalo where they lived and appearing in a snowbank near their grandparents' house in Mayville out on what's now known as Honeysett Road, claiming not to have known how they got there and gotten there faster than they could possibly have gotten there, even by train. And they were well known to conductors on all the trains that came through the area, so they interviewed the conductors and other persons, and they hadn't been seen on the train, so they'd figured out something there. And Ira Davenport did end up living in Mayville until he died. Harry Houdini, of course, came to visit him in Mayville to learn the secrets of the spirit cabinet and what was called the Davenport tie, which was a particular way that they tied themselves so that they could look like they were tied up, easily get their hands out and use them to play the musical instruments that they used in their what they called the dark seance. And he's did live in Mayville for a number of years until his death in 1911. And he's buried down down in Mayville Cemetery down there. In some circles, he's quite famous. So.
Mayville is the capital of Chautauqua County. And I know many in the old days, lawyers had to come to Mayville to not only continue to argue the cases, but had to really kind of take the train up here, spend the night, do the trials, come back, even to record papers. Why Mayville? Is that just a central location, or?
Well, yes. Early on, the Holland Land Company had agreed to provide property, 4.5 acres for courthouse and jail, governmental facilities, and since they were putting their, they had put their land company agent up here, that's where the property was. So the property that the courthouse is on, what's now the Village Green Park in Mayville, that was originally part of that property. The county did eventually give the park part of that property to the village. The old jail was behind that, where there's a parking lot now with the newer jail and the newer additions onto that jail. And it's now the John Bentley Public Safety Building. So that's why that was there. The first courthouse was built in 1815. That was a wooden courthouse, had a couple of rooms that served as jail cells. They had someone that lived in there. The very earliest of the courts took place in Scott's Tavern, which was a tavern.
That's the bar. I like it.
Yeah.
I got that.
Yeah. Yeah. Took place in that. Up overhead, they had a ladder that they went upstairs, and they pulled the ladder up behind them when courts were in session up there. That's the very earliest of the courts in 1811.
That was before open session, so when the session started, nobody could get in. I love it. Or get out. What's the story in the park behind that statue of a little girl and the fountain there? What's the story there?
Oh, that's interesting. Nobody really knows quite where that came from or when. There's speculation. There's postcards showing that back into the very early 1800s, and a previous village historian traced that back into possibly as early as the 1880s being there. But that statue has been there a long time. It was, I guess, originally property of the county because it was on county property there. And the county did maintain it for a great many years before they gave it to the village. Also the fountain that went with it, and so on and so forth. But there's never been a bill of sale found or anything that really indicates quite when it came from. It's similar to other statues. The County Museum in Westfield has one that's quite similar to that they have out front of the museum now, where there was a fountain. But there's no definitive answer as to exactly when that came to the village or how or where.
Devon, you're being such a long-standing historian, and you look at stuff and you're searching. Every once in a while, do you find something saying, I can't believe what I just unearthed? Or you pick up the phone and you call John Schmitz and say, John, guess what I found? Has there been sort of a aha moment where kind of what you thought you were going to find turned out to be something entirely different?
Yeah. Sometimes looking into the archaeological past, I've had some surprises around here. I mentioned a little bit about that. I don't really want to give away any locations or sites or anything like that. But there's that. There's things with the railroad coming in, where the roads used to run, who built the roads. Sometimes some of the things that you find out from old newspapers. There was a legal case back in 1910 that I just happened to find in the newspaper, and it involved a party and a boathouse at the head of the lake and a woman of color, and somehow she ended up dead, and there was quite a scandal and a trial about that. And you find things like that that are interesting, and I really don't know what all that went on. I'm sure the court records still existed if anybody wanted to look into it further. But it must have been quite a scandal at the time, so you run into little things like that. And, you run into fun things too, like there was a supposed haunting in Mayville on one time on Erie Street, where there was a vacant house that there were lights in there at night and sounds and things going on, and got the reputation of being haunted, and people started investigating, and it turned out to be a local merchant meeting somebody else's wife there for a little get-together. So,
care to elaborate?
No.
I'm sure they're reading scripture. So what else? What other aha moments? You're on a roll here, Devon. I can see that you've got this kind of, what were the surprise moments?
Well, you get some sad ones too. Suicides that have taken place, other murders that have taken place. How things developed. Sometimes you'll find things that are written down as history that you find contradictions.
Such as?
Well, I don't want to get into some specifics on some of the things because there are. I think I'd get myself into trouble, but...
book to follow. He's hanging us. What's the question tonight you expected that I might ask that you hope I didn't?
There isn't one. When I agreed to come, I pretty much figured I'd answer any question you asked.
Anybody have any questions from the gallery here of Devon about Mayville, Chautauqua, railroads, Republican Party?
About Scott's Tavern. Which building is Scott's Tavern?
Scott's Tavern isn't there anymore, but if you look next to the brick buildings, next to the park up there, you will see a historical sign that says this is the site of Scott's Tavern where the first courts held session. That was long gone. There was a doctor's office. There was an Episcopal church there in the park too. Those burned down in a 1902 fire, and it's been nothing but a park ever since. So,
when do you think the peak of Mayville's prominence was? About what time?
Well, 1900 into probably early 1930s. You had a lot of passenger traffic and the railroads were extensive. There was the ice industry, there was the furniture industry, there was Gravett cider vinegar plant. There was a canning factory in Mayville that did canning. There was Chautauqua malted milk they shipped by railroad. The Kling's furniture factory was a large thing. Passengers used to come in by train. to Mayville, and they would catch the steamboat for various places around the lake, including Chautauqua, Jamestown, Point Chautauqua, the regular steamboat lines. There were quite a number of sidings there where they'd put trains off. There were mills. Of course, there were the 5 large ice houses that they shipped to extensive amounts of ice to Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Cleveland. So that time period would, I think, have been the height of Mayville.
When did Ethan Allen come in?
Ethan Allen, let's see if I remember the exact date on that. Let's see, the Klings sold out to Baumritter Corporation in, I think it was 1962 or 1963. And it was a few years after that that Ethan Allen bought them out, and it became, it was always called the Kling plant, but it was the Kling division of Ethan Allen after that. So I do have the information, but I don't remember it right offhand. I would have to look that up, which I could take the time to do here.
Just reading your article here, Ethan Allen made furniture, but closed their plant April 21st, 2003.
Yes. Yep. And the last shipment to go out by railroad, the railroad stopped passenger traffic in 1949. It wasn't profitable anymore, and as business and industry that shipped via railroad went out in Mayville, it became a lot less viable of a branch line. It was called the Chautauqua branch. And Kling's was really only the major shipper that was still shipping out. So in December of 1978, the last shipment of furniture went out from Ethan Allen. And that was the very last train that came into Mayville.
And the smokestack, where the old wire form plant was and everything, the Wappet?
Yeah, Wappet.
Yeah, what's the history of the Wappet?
Well, the Wappets came here from Pittsburgh, and they manufactured high-quality circular saws, which I've got one of at home. I bought here at a household sale. There are a number of them around. Some museums have some of them. They built some very high quality industrial strength worm drive gear that were larger ones. They built them for home use. They were a very high quality circular saw, and that's what they built there.
Thank you.
And that was the Wappet factory they manufactured there.
Devon, you mentioned that you had made some archaeological discoveries and you didn't really want to talk about them, but is there any that you could talk about?
Well, I could tell you that a large number of artifacts were found, for example, at the foot of the hill where opposite the courthouse where the diner is now, and the old school, which is up on top of the hill. When they dug that out, they found a number of artifacts. When they were digging for the Chautauqua Traction Company to put the building in down there, it's now where they sell the kayaks and all that. They found a number of artifacts there in quantity, and there were a number of charcoal fires found down in the old fire pits, found down in the general area where the Chautauqua Bell is sitting now up on rails for the winter. Now that park and that property where the railroad depot is, that was not as it is originally. The railroad depot was built out into the lake at that point in order to keep the tracks level through the area. And the ice houses were built along the shore. The first ice house opened 1871, also approximately where the Chautauqua Belle sits. In 1875, they filled in that property between the where the railroad depot was and the shoreline had originally been, and they also extended the where the park is, the shoreline further out there, and that shows on old maps. So you find that, and also the terminus of the original Indian Trail and French Road was somewhere in Mayville at the head of the lake. The other end was at Barcelona, and there was what they called a baking oven or a cooking oven located at both ends. That they were seen remnants of those up into the early 1800s. The exact site has now been lost. One of the French expeditions, the Frenchman, and my French pronunciation will be terrible, but Chassego de Lery drew a map of the area where the French encampment was, and it shows a big bay area there on that end of the lake, which doesn't really match up to anything that's there now. I have often wondered if what it was that area before they filled it in for the park, but you know, I've got no evidence of that. So there's some question as to exactly where it was, but somewhere in the Mayville area was the other end of the original Indian portage and then the French portage.
A lot of hotels grew up around the area. There was one at Lighthouse Point.
Yes.
Can you tell us anything about that?
Well, yeah, it burned down in 1902, if memory serves me correctly. And of course, that was, they had the dock there. Joan Smith was just showing me some photos here she had early of the hotel there and some of the other things with the lighthouse on the dock down there. It was very famous, very popular place to stay. The hotels, of course, really built up. Of course, there's some down in Jamestown, but once the I guess you'd call the tourist traffic could really come in by train and take the steamboats around the lake, that's when the era of the large hotels around the lake really came into being, because there was, you know, the summertime population there that could support them. So you had the Fox House in Mayville on the corner. You had the Mayville House uptown. You had, of course, the hotel at Bemis Point, and really all around the lake.
Well, we had always heard that the Lighthouse Point Hotel was the closest hotel to Chautauqua where you could have liquor.
Yeah. Yes, there was at one time a law on the books in the area that you could purchase liquor elsewhere, but you could not drink it on premises. And it was a kind of confused little time. And then, of course, during Prohibition, which was after the after that time, of course, a lot of there were a lot of people that sold alcohol. The Lakeview Hotel down there, they were always raiding that. Sometimes they found liquor there, sometimes they didn't. There were well-known bootleggers in the area, people that ran bootleg booze over from Lake Erie. Of course, a lot of it came over from Canada. It was a lot more, and my father remembered this, the area. He said it was a lot more well-known than that. But yeah, that would have been the closest to Chautauqua, because Chautauqua, as most of you probably remember, there was no alcohol sales, or even not really supposed to have it on the grounds for a good many years until it was decided that alcohol could be sold on the grounds, and it was as I understand it, so it could raise revenue.
Devon, I read someplace that probably John Lunsman, when he did a series on the lakes,
Mm-hmm.
you know, which was terrific. I recommend anybody who wants to know about the history of the lakes. Lunsman did that his final couple of years. About the spot someplace outside of Mayville where if you put a drop of water on that particular road and it heads in this direction, it'll work its way down the Mississippi, as you just said, ultimately into the Gulf of Mexico. And if it goes on the other side of the road, it'll ultimately find itself into Lake Erie and find itself into the Atlantic.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of places where you can do that near Mayville. The one that you probably most easily be able to find is on Beaujean Road, where you go quite a ways down, but not quite all the way far down as Crawford Road, but it shows on maps of where the watershed is. And if you stand on that road, the water on the one side will go into the Atlantic Ocean, and if you goes out the other side, it'll go down into Chautauqua Creek and into Lake Erie. And then on up the other way. Yeah, Niagara Falls and all that, yeah. So, yeah, that's where that spot is.
We're going to conclude now because we've gone a little bit over because you're that good.
Thanks.
And I appreciate that. But you're a historian extraordinaire, Devon. What's the role of a historian in today's society? It does, you know, I often get a sense of the younger population, children, probably not often as activated as certainly a group of this demographics. But what's the role? What do you see it as you kind of describe in 2018 terms the role of a historian?
Well, I'm a local historian, even though I am a New York State historian. New York State has a unique system of historians, and my role as historian, as I look at it, is to discover, document, and try and preserve the history for the future for the people that are interested. As far as young people getting interested in history goes, that's something that often doesn't take place until they're a little bit older. You know, they get over their youth a little bit. Like I said, I didn't get interested a lot until I was about age 35. And historians in general, I think, are looking to do the same thing, disseminate it, keep in the memory. You don't want memories of the Holocaust to disappear. You know, there's the saying that those who don't know history are bound to repeat the mistakes of history. So you want those things preserved. And you can learn from the past about things that are going on that will affect the future, too. If you and then, of course, this is going way outside what you might consider a historian's job, but if you look at evidence coming from Antarctic ice in the past as to what things were like, you can actually find out what conditions on life on Earth and the climate were from the past.
Look at this crowd. Not only it stayed with you all the way and over into overtime because of you, Devon. So I want to thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, Devon Taylor.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll clap for myself.
Wow. Good. Well, thank you very much.